supposed to be a workshop on dreams, specifically the work of C.G. Jung. And Jung's been mentioned so many times tonight that I feel as if there's not too much more to say, except that of course, we haven't talked about dreams specifically. But I think I'll just say a couple of things about where I think this hooks into the general subject and what we've been talking about, and then I'd like to hear from you what you want to know and talk about and comment on, ask about, and so forth. The first thing that occurred to me was when we talk about altered states of consciousness, that Jung doesn't actually talk about this as such, because this is a topic that's kind of arisen, I think, in the last few years as a general interest. And since Jung died in 1961, he kind of missed his opportunity to talk about it as such. But I think that in his work on the collective unconscious, that he was dealing with many of the things that we've been talking about, and that he would say that the material, much of the material that is that comes up in altered states of consciousness, the images, the experiences, the emotional states, and so forth, come out of the collective unconscious, out of the archetypal world, so that's probably the place where it hooks in most directly. Now, dreams, of course, are one of the major sources of information about the collective unconscious, and the dream state itself could be called an altered state of consciousness. There is a book that some of you may have seen, edited by Charles Tart, called Altered States of Consciousness, and that book includes a whole section on dreams, articles by various people on the physiological studies on dreams and so forth, so that apparently the editor of that book, anyway, thought that also. Then I noticed, and one other thing about Jung specifically, he started his psychiatric career, and his medical career really, with a work on occult phenomena, which some of you may have heard of, which appears in Volume 1 of Jung's collected works, where he took the case of a young woman who had sort of somnambulistic states, and the material.
The basketball score tonight: Augsburg 93, Hamlin 75.
Yay! Is that the final score? So anyway, the occult phenomena, I think, are a form of this also. I would like to add, too, that I think many kinds of emotional states are altered states of consciousness and are states in which this kind of material can be found. The reason I'm mentioning these things is that I think that we think in terms of drug-induced states very often, or something of that kind, and actually these things are available in other ways. Brantner also mentioned several things that relate to some of Jung's notions in this area. One of them is that light and darkness are probably at the center of the kinds of experiences we're talking about, and that in seeking the light we may meet the darkness also, which is one of the reasons why it's so scary. And I think many people do avoid it, and maybe rightly so. Maybe they're too vulnerable. He also mentioned that this experience leads to, he was talking about the transcendental experience, of course, leads to visible consequences and always a transformation. And a transformation, again, is one of the things that Jung talks about, and particularly the bringing together of the opposites, leading to, which of course include light and darkness, as leading into transformation. And then the fact that the voice always says something that is new and unpredictable. This is what Jung says about dreams, that if all you get from the dream is something you already know, you've probably missed something. Because the dream, the unconscious, as he says, doesn't waste much spit telling you something you already know. So that's one of the things that we look for in dreams. So that kind of is an introduction, and now I'd like to hear from you what sorts of things you want to talk about. And what sort of could a few of you maybe say what led you to come to this group rather than one of the others?
How much do you think the Jungian analysis of dreams helps you analyze your dreams versus just pre-associating or just trying to get out of yourself what the dream meant to you? In other words, do you need this structure all the time to analyze?
What kind of a structure do do you
Well, the
envision as
symbols,
being?
the horse means something, and the tower means something, and whatever his symbols were, water is
Oh.
spirit, and things like that. Or are you better off just free associating?
You need both. Actually, Jung says that most of the dream symbols are individual. That you can't say the horse means this and water means that and so forth. Then, of course, he goes right on and says there are relatively fixed symbols. But you start with the personal associations. If you dream about a particular person, well, what is that? What do you know about that person? Sometimes it's a known figure, and sometimes it's unknown, but you have some notion. Or you dream about a particular animal or something, so that you go as far as you can go with that. But in many dreams, or at least I should say in some dreams, I don't know what proportion they are, but there are images that you either can't associate to, or where your associations aren't adequate. And those very often are what we call the archetypal images. They come from some level that is beyond your learning experience. They aren't part of your personal background. And at that point, then you need the mythological and other associations, or what we call amplifications, in order to understand those images. And of course, I think there are many images where there's some of both. You dream about your mother, for instance, and that's this particular woman who lives on such and such a street and so forth, but she also represents the archetypal mother in many dreams anyway, and the reason she has such an influence on you is because of the archetypal force as well as your personal experience with this particular woman. That's just one of many examples of that. Do you want to comment any further?
So in other words, you could use both.
Yeah.
You start with your own free associations.
Yeah.
Words, if I were to
Jung
give
doesn't
you-
use the word free association because that implies taking the element in the dream and then just associating to the association to the association. He says you should stick closer to it than that. You should just take the associations immediately around each image. So when you're talking about Jungian dream analysis, it's better just to use the term association rather than free association, but that's a technical point. Yeah.
Did Jung say anything about any way to facilitate dream retention?
Not exactly. Although I think he says that most people who start working on their dreams do tend to remember. You mean just the problem of remembering what you dreamed. And that is a bit of a problem with some people. There are some people who just remember, so much they can't work on it all. Other people have much more difficulty. And I've found that most people, when they begin paying attention, do remember more. Now, this still may mean they go up from twice a year to twice a month or something like that, whereas other people remember 3 dreams a night. So there are individual differences. I would think that if worst came to worst, you could go to one of the dream labs, where they wake people up when they have the rapid eye movements, and then you always remember dreams. They haven't missed yet, I think, on that is not every awakening, but I mean every person that they've worked with in those labs has remembered dreams if they were awakened at the time that they were showing these physiological signs. Might be a little expensive because I think the nearest one is probably Chicago, but
The
there is that possibility.
To me is looking at this popularized edition of Man and His Symbols. And I find that I haven't read it yet, but every time I look in that book, I dream more.
Oh,
Remember more. And this is happening.
I see. Well, so you aren't desperate yet. You remember. Yeah, well, this is true. You mean you just look at the pictures or something?
Yeah,
You mean?
they're archetypal images taken from
Yeah,
meanings
this
and
stuff
so on.
is volatile, isn't it? Yeah, well, I think a lot of people are stimulated, and you could be stimulated that way by many things, of course. I'm sure a novel or an emotional experience or anything. But when you read the archetypal material, many people are stimulated by that.
I think you can be stimulated just to dreams, not specifically about any given thing.
No, I think you might be stimulated to dream about certain things, certain kinds of material. Oh, yeah, of course. It might not be what you expected, but if dreams are compensatory, as Jung says they're always related to the conscious situation. And the conscious situation includes what you're reading and all kinds of things, so that every dream supposedly is related to something in your life. Now, it may not be just what happened yesterday. If it's an archetypal dream especially, it may be related to a much broader spectrum of experiences. Excuse me. No.
If they're compensatory, are they also supernatural?
Supernatural? What do you mean?
Well, any of these different words these men have been using tonight.
Well, they seem to object to the word supernatural. At least
I'm sorry.
Sibley did. I don't see dreams as. I mean, some people would call it supernatural when you talk about the collective unconscious, but I don't know. I see the collective unconscious as a natural phenomenon. It's it's part of human beings, and supernatural kind of implies that it's way beyond someplace.
What was it? Sibley used some supernormal.
Paranormal,
right.
yeah.
Would you consider them that? Or?
Well, it's sort of in between on that because so many people have archetypal dreams that you wouldn't. It's really normal. It's just it's everyday experience for some people, or every night. Oh,
Is that a hard question? I don't know.
I don't know. Jung's books are so full of them. In fact, that's practically all they are. The books are. He takes archetypal dreams and goes sailing off into the blue, amplifying them and so forth. And I don't know, dreams that have green lions and horses that do strange things and water and forests and I can't tell you a typical dream, but I mean these are some of the images that seem to be archetypal. There was somebody back here that had her hand up.
I'm very much a layman in this area. I wonder, has psychiatry derived any positive value from the study of dreams? And if so, could you say in just a general way what those kinds of
You mean in terms of therapy? Well, psychiatry in general is has done less with it than the Jungian school. Freud, of course, started the whole business of dreams, using dreams in psychotherapy, and used them rather extensively for a good while, and then he kind of dribbled off and didn't pay as much attention to them, and the Freudian school in general has used them, some, but not as much, whereas the Jungian school tends to use them consistently. I think every Jungian analyst would work with dreams with a good proportion of his patients, not with all, but with many. So that I'd say that that's kind of the way it's gone. Now, as far as research on dreams, this is an extremely difficult matter. And a number of people have written books on different methods of dream interpretation and so forth, but it's very hard to find any way to test whether the interpretations are right. And that's sort of what I'm interested in working on, but I keep looking for ways to get a hold of it. Does that answer your question? As far as therapy is concerned, of course, the use of the dreams in therapy is highly varied. Sometimes you just talk about the dream and it brings up the fact that the person is concerned with a particular problem, and then you spend the rest of the session talking about that problem and never get back to the dream. Other times you follow the dream very closely and try to see what it says specifically about the problem, so that they have a very practical use, but the theory and the scientific substantiation is less clear. Somebody else over here.
Oh, I wondered if, I think many of us in here are really quite on the lay level, as someone said, and I wonder if you would not give us some more specific information about what Jung's view of dreams actually is. I think many of us know nothing.
I was afraid you'd ask me that. I just happen to have a 250-page thesis on that subject. Yeah, I can't give you, and in fact, it takes me about an hour and a half to give the basics, but I'll give the basics. I mean, a few of them anyway. If the rest of you are interested in this, are you interested in about 5 minutes on what are kind of the main aspects of Jung's theory? Those of you who know more about it can bear with us and maybe add to it. Well, he sees dreams first as spontaneous products of the unconscious. They just happen. You can't will them, as somebody was asking about. The language of dreams, of course, is mainly imagery, pictures, and so forth. Although there are visual, auditory aspects also. One of the main things that Jung stresses over and over and over again is the dream is not a disguise. It means what it says. And of course here is where he's reacting against Freud's notion that the dream is a disguise, and you have to get from the manifest content to the latent content. Jung says that isn't true. The dream means what it says. Our problem is to understand its language. And of course, interpreting the language is like taking a Sanskrit text when you don't know Sanskrit and figuring out, or a code or something like that. But it can be done. So you start with the personal associations of the dreamer and try to find out what the images seem to mean to him. One of the most important guidelines is the notion of compensation, that the dream is trying to tell you something that will modify your conscious attitude. Sometimes contradicts it, but it can be everywhere from actually a confirmation to a contradiction. It's also predicated on the concept of the self-regulation of the psyche. That's very closely related to compensation. That is, the psyche is a whole, and it is. But what we have in consciousness is only a part of it, and so the unconscious and the conscious are always in a state of interaction. That's what we mean by self-regulation. Now, one of the big things that I find extremely helpful in dream interpretation is Jung's idea of the subjective and the objective point of view. I would say that much of Freudian dream interpretation is on the objective level. If you dream about your brother, it means your brother, and whatever the dream says has to do with your attitude toward your brother. Jung says that that isn't necessarily true. It may be your brother, and that's what he calls the objective, but it may be someone who represents something in you. Now, he also says that if you dream about your brother, it's more likely to be about him. If you dream about your great-aunt Matilda, who died 20 years ago, that she's more likely to represent a part of you, on the basis that she is not an important part of your present life. So that then you would associate to, what does great-aunt Matilda mean to me? What kind of a person was she? And very often you discover that she had a particular characteristic which you maybe either liked or didn't like, and that this represents a part of you which you either like or don't like. Very often it's one you don't like, of course. And then Jung also talks about the reductive and the constructive approaches to dreams. Freud used mainly the reductive. That is, he tried to take the dream and work back to some elemental or some basic elements in the personality, such as sexual interest or aggression or those things that Freud was concerned about. And this is what we call the reductive. Jung says many dreams are constructive. They're leading you forward. They have a purpose. And they're trying to tell you, here's something that you need to develop, or here's something that is a potential in you, and you should look at that. So those are the main things. There's a lot more to say, of course, but I think we'll leave it there for the moment. Yeah.
Much of the dreaming we've talked about now involves objects that, of course, aren't present.
Mm-hmm.
What is the understanding that Jung has for the phenomena that I've experienced and other people I've talked to sometimes confirmed experiencing, where you seem to be awake in the place where you are sleeping, for instance. In fact, you can see the room or the surroundings. And you're either being approached by something extremely terrible or extremely joyous, but you can't really see any particular concrete thing.
Can you hear
overwhelming
back there? Could you speak up a little bit?
When you're having when you're dreaming, you seem to be awake, and on a couple of occasions your eyes actually blink awake and you actually see the room consciously, and then you go back into sleep, but it's though you're looking at the room. It may be slightly darker, but it's the place where you're asleep, and you're filled with the impression of a great approaching sorrow, horror, or joy. And in fact, I've experienced a fibrillation of the eardrums, as though there's some sort of soundless screaming or something going on at a very short distance, but you can't hear. What sort of thing is this?
Well,
you're
I think
paralyzed.
that the state of business, the state of dreaming you're awake or something like that, probably has to do with different levels of sleep, you know, and the notion of something horrible or something joyous about to happen, you know, this could be a form of ESP, or it could be be a straight dream state where you know, these potentials are always there. It's hard to say, and you know, it's hard to say what a particular situation means without knowing all the context of it.
I talked to one fellow about this seminary type, and he suggested an idea. I want you to think about it. That it's the experience of what we call in religion the satanic or the beatific. You know, like this is a very normal scene. It may be your room,
Yeah.
and yet there's something radically wrong. Either you don't belong there, or whatever it is shouldn't be there.
Mm-hmm.
It's very total.
Yeah, well, that has to do with with sort of what Brantner was talking about the good and evil both being possible, and you know, I think that.
Maybe there could be some kind of a physical basis to that kind of dream, because that's, I think, similar to the dream that everybody has that they're falling and they land. It's almost a feeling, more than just a, you know, a picture. Maybe there's something physical to this state.
I think you could say it's archetypal in the sense that it is a very common human experience, and it takes on an intensity in this lowered state of, we can call it an altered state of consciousness. I think of it as lowered in the sense that all the conscious controls are kind of put aside when you're asleep.
I wonder what he makes of nightmares. How does this fit into, for instance, a compensatory?
Nightmares are funny because, funny, yeah, peculiar. In fact, any dream that has a strong emotional content is they're particularly interesting, of course, but you can't be sure that because you feel negative about the dream that it's a negative dream. There are dreams where you just, you know, you're scared to death, or you're horrified, or you think something's terrible, and when you actually analyze the dream, you discover that at least part of the message is quite positive. So a nightmare, well, I just take a nightmare as a dream that scares you. Are you defining it more specifically than that?
You know, you mentioned one of his views of dreams was as compensatory, and I wonder how a nightmare fits into that idea.
Well, you can't generalize. I mean, it depends on the content of the dream. So what I'm saying is that it could, for instance, you dream that somebody died, and it's just horrible. You know, you're just sick and scared and all sorts of things. And you think, gee, if that person really did die, it would be just awful. And that's kind of a nightmare. But when you analyze the dream, sometimes that person means something to you that's something that should die in you. And so that's what I mean by it can be a good dream.
I also wanted to ask about the absence of nightmares. I know some people, I don't know many, who do not experience nightmares. They are never frightened.
Oh, well, no, that's hard to know. Some people do a good job of repressing, and other people probably just are, you know, maybe they're just well adjusted. I don't know. I think I'd be more worried about somebody that just has nightmares all the time. I mean, you know, I think that should be paid attention to.
You say dream that somebody's going to die. You say that part of that person's got away from you. Is that what you said?
Part of you. If that person represents something in you which should die, it's a part, or that you should give up. You know, it may be you maybe dream that a baby dies or something, and it may be that some infantile part of yourself should die. This is just an example, you know. I'm not telling you that every dream like that is like that. It's just a possibility. Yeah.
I don't think because I mean, so I read psyche symbol and I wrote my things down for about 3-4 months, and anyway, I was ended up in the bathroom somewhere. This is around the river. Like I read it for my grandmother, something in the horse pants and diet. And there were 2 instances, one with feet common, one with where I fell in the toilet when I was 2 years old. So I thought, well, perhaps these were the reason. And then I would psych myself up to say, I should not dream. I meant this. I did that tonight. It just got really boring. A little bit, and it came back, and then finally, such as it just go. Or
self-help, it came out, mother going to the toilet in front of you. And that seemed to be it. And I don't know.
Did the dream stop then after that?
So I don't know.
No.
I convinced myself that it's possible.
Well, Jung gives examples of this, where when the dream is of recurring dreams or recurring themes, such as that, and when the dream or the theme is finally understood, it stops. Yeah, he mentioned some of the experiences of those, so this is very possible. But of course, when you record your dreams over a fairly limited period of time like that, the fact that you get the same themes over and over again doesn't mean that's all of you. It would probably mean that that's what the unconscious is occupied with at that time, and 6 months later it might be something else. Yeah.
Corporations and businesses of various kinds have been preparing their senior citizens who will be facing retirement, say at age 65 or 70, by some advanced gearing in preparations for retirement. One of the things that I have noticed coming out in some of those sessions has been older men, and these aren't men, most of these men were college trained and probably with 3 or 4 years beyond college in graduate work, and then complaining that as they grew older, the intensification of bad dreams was increasing. And they were searching for something. Well, I remember an answer that one MD gave. This was about 6 years ago, and I'm wondering if anything was developed later in the studies. Has anything been shown that would indicate any relationship between this and early experiences in life? And whether an effort should be made to snuff those out. The doctor simply said, well, enough research has not gone into this. He didn't want to prescribe or add anything.
Well, now what are you saying? That as they get older, the incidence of bad dreams is greater?
Certain individuals.
At least with certain individuals.
In groups like that, and searching for an answer, and up to this point I have heard no good explanation for that.
Well, certainly the pressure of certain life problems would increase when a person is facing retirement, or any change in one's life situation. And this is another place where I think Jung is particularly helpful in terms of what he has to say about the second half of life and the changing tasks of life as one gets older. Erik Erikson talks about this too. Actually, his later stages, I think, are very, very close to some of the things that Jung talks about. But the fact that after a person has kind of gotten established and he's gone maybe as far as he can go in his work, and his family is established and children are growing up and are gone and so forth, then he really does meet a crisis in life. And this is a crisis of meaning. Now, we all know that young people are concerned about this too, and particularly in these days, young people seem to be very much concerned about meaning and all. But there is a specific life crisis which probably will happen to them too, on a different level when they get to be 45 or 50. And the retirement is kind of the culmination, I'd say, of that life crisis, because all of a sudden you don't have something to occupy yourself with. You don't have a reason for existence in order to do this job, and you're just you're just suddenly stuck with yourself. And I think it'd be surprising if many people didn't hit an emotional crisis at that time, and the dreams would reflect it. No, I don't. Maybe a lot more need. I'd be interested in knowing some of the data on that, because I haven't known about too many studies that are kind of age oriented. Back there.
We seem to spend a lot of time talking about how dreams relate to our waking life. But it seems to me that we're looking at it the wrong way, because really, we start out our lives, dreaming almost all the time, and it's more like, it's like sending astronauts to the moon to gather data, and then they come back and they just journey out for
a short time and then they come back, and then after a long time they go over there and they find something else out and they come back. But this is the same way we do with our dreams, kind of when we're just really small. We just kind of venture out in the waking world and then we come back.
I see what you mean. Yeah, sort of like Jung and the yogi. Which is the primary state.
And I wonder if anybody's taken this approach that our home base is our mind or our dreams. I think that
I think that in a way Jung does take this attitude. Have any of you read Memories, Dreams, and Reflections? It is sometimes called Jung's autobiography. It isn't an autobiography because he says very little about his outer life. It's sort of frustrating to people who want to know all these things, but it deals mostly with his inner life, and which is what I think you're talking about: the dreams, the fantasies, the feelings, and so forth. And I think that to many people that these things are at least to all of us in a way they're of equal value. It's just that some of us consciously live more on one side than on the other. And in our culture, we are a highly extroverted culture, so that we think in terms of the outer achievement. Whereas in the Eastern cultures, I think they emphasize the inner more. So that's partly a cultural prejudice. Does that answer it all, or no? Yeah, here.
I think in one section of his Man in the Symbols, he commented that, like, barbaric man understood a lot of things in nature, and that civilized man has come farther away from these natural things, and that dreams are our inner selves attempting again to interpret these natural symbols.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if, like you care to comment, are we going in the wrong direction, and was, barbaric man really?
Well, I don't think we have much choice. We've come this far, and civilization has done things to us. And in a way, this is good, though, because what's happened is that we have achieved a certain level of consciousness that makes we've separated the opposites, so to speak, and now we have to reconcile them. And this is partly what some of this business about the change in the into the Aquarian age and so forth, that we seem to be at the end of an era, and that era, the Christian era, has been a time of separating the opposites, knowing what's good and evil, and much of the biblical material is about that. But now we have to go beyond that, kind of transcend it. That's somebody who hasn't had a chance. You. Okay.
Yeah, can the average person, without the help of an analyst, make any significant progress in interpreting his own dreams towards his growth?
So some people have done it. I know of a few people who have gotten a group of maybe 3 or 4 friends together and worked on their dreams together. And I haven't had this experience myself. But,
well, it's very interesting, I think, to pay attention to your dreams and maybe record them or something. But as far as it doesn't make any sense for you to even attempt to really interpret.
Yeah, I think you probably need the help of at least one other person. Now, it doesn't have to be an analyst, but it's very hard to understand your own dreams yourself. Jung says that about his even. He doesn't understand. I think he exaggerates, actually, but he didn't understand his own dreams. But he actually did have people that he worked with on his own dreams. And the point being, you see, if the dream tells you something you don't know, then it must be hitting you in some blind spot. And so it's very difficult for you to get it by yourself. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't try, but I think it would be helpful if you had a friend whom you could trust, who might reflect back to you some of the things that he sees as a possibility. I think you need to do this kind of carefully, though, because just hitting hitting each other over the head with this sort of thing wouldn't be good either. Yeah.
Yeah, will you comment more on the statement you said about the Christian era being one in which we separate them?
Well, could you tell me a little bit more what you want to know?
Well, I think that I got the influence that consciousness end product of evolution, being evolutionary. Then is the inference that consciousness can still be in the and or different states.
Well, I think consciousness has different meanings, and the meaning that we have used, you know, our culture in general has used up to this point mostly is this business of separation of dark and light, and the consciousness is light. Christ is depicted as all good in the Christian, in the usual Christian tradition anyway, and but all goodness is not whole. So that in order to have wholeness, we have to bring the dark and the light back together again, and that's another level of consciousness, I would say. Now that the words get a little tricky, you know, and some people say, well, you're just playing with words, but this wholeness is really a higher consciousness than the light by itself, with the dark repressed, which is what we've done. Yeah.
With research, you said you were interested in seeing whether the interpretations were accurate. Could you tell something like how you go about that? You can't replicate dreams, I guess. You start with diagnosis of a problem, or some diagnosis of behavioral stuff, or theory.
Yeah, well, I think that the place one would look is to try to get some relationship between the dream interpretation and behavioral results, or I can't remember now what were some. I had some. Some of the things that I played around with in my thesis were comparing different schools and their approaches, and actually I didn't get very far with this. I sort of raised the issue and pointed out the problems, and but Jung uses some examples, for instance, of where he interpreted a dream in a certain way, and that he actually made a prediction of what was going to happen. Well, that's kind of precognitive almost, and but the fact that he was able to do this with a few dreams was at least a validation of the fact that dreams have meaning. Now, the problem is that most dreams aren't like that. He gives the example, for instance, of the acquaintance of his who stopped him on the street and told him that he dreamed that he was mountain climbing, and this guy was a great mountain climber, and that in one dream he just stepped off into space and awoke in pure ecstasy. And Jung says, you know, my dear fellow, next time don't go out alone anymore. Be sure you take 2 guides and do precisely what they tell you to. And the guy says, oh, well, you're incurable or incorrigible or something, and he goes off and proceeds to step off a mountain. And so it wasn't that Jung was predicting that he was going to do precisely what he did in the dream, but that his state of mind was such that he was so inflated that he just thought he was beyond the law of gravity. Yeah.
You talk about jumping off into the middle of nowhere and things, and like sometimes sleeping, you're on the verge of the bed, you fall out, and your limb, like your leg, will go over the edge. And this seems to tie in together with an elaborate construct.
Yeah.
Where you're out in the middle of something, like a door slams.
Yeah.
And you have a whole sequence of events going on, and then suddenly you wake up and the door is just slamming. Now, how fast do the synapses work? I mean, dreaming is supposed to take only a few minutes, isn't it? A lot of dreaming.
Well, no, it's actually the physiological research indicates that the dream takes about as long as the event would have taken. But what seems to happen is that this outer stimulus that is built into the dream gets put in very quickly. You may have a whole series of events that end up with the bell ringing, which is the alarm going off, but actually much of the stuff would have been there anyway. You know.
Like, for instance, the alarm going off or the door slamming or something seems to initiate the cycle. It's actually fed back into the beginning. Can that happen
it actually is fed in at the point of probably, although we can't be sure.
You remember it when you hear it at the point of waking up.
Yeah, and it probably changes the course of the dream at that point, to some degree. Who hasn't had a chance to ask a question? You.
I was wondering if any studies have been made on dreams that seem to appear in color.
In color? Yeah, there have been some. The results haven't been too conclusive. But there are great individual differences, of course, in who dreams in color and who doesn't. The only thing I can remember specifically is that women dream in color more than men. But it's like 40% to 25% or something like that, you know. So it doesn't mean that if you have color dreams that you're feminine or something. I just mean that there are differences like that. But it's been very difficult to get conclusive results. Some of them have been conflicting. And also some people are more aware of the fact they dream in color, and so there's more certainty about it than others.
Are there any dreams seem to be strictly for entertainment? That's not as funny as it sounds, but I've had some epic dreams that seem to take all night, and they're just as entertaining as a
I'm sure that some of them are jokes, you know. Whether the epic dreams are the same thing or not, I don't know. But some of them, you as soon as you tell it or hear it, you laugh because it's funny, and that doesn't tell you the whole meaning of it. But I doubt that there are any that are strictly for entertainment. You know.
I wanted just to comment. I once read one that was a splendid movie. It was like a 2.5 hour movie, and I woke up and said, "That was so good. I'd love to see it again." And I fell back asleep and dreamt right through.
Oh my gosh! You have a well-trained projectionist in your unconscious.
I wanted to say something to the man who was commenting on the dreams of older people and the increase in nightmares. I don't think there's any real study on this, but I've also heard reported that in some older people there's a great increase in richness, entertaining dreams. Isak Dinesen reports this, and reports in a number of other people.
Who reported? Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Yeah, well, I think that if this business about the second half of life is correct, it certainly is. One might expect that the dream life, the inner life, becomes more important, or could become more important anyway. Yeah.
I've read about other people who they're waking up, but I was wondering if it really accounts for people who do this that have done this. Also, another question, if he talks about dreams that lack any story, but are just very unique to that.
I don't know of any specific, you know, nice thing about Jung is that he assumes anything is possible, and he says so repeatedly that, you know, if you have a dream of such and such a kind, that is a psychological fact, that you had that dream. Now what it means is, of course, a whole other problem, but he doesn't push anything aside as impossible or crazy or, you know, unimportant, so I don't know. That's about all I can say. I don't know if it's dealing with those problems specifically, but it may be there. Not that I recall, but it might be in some of that early material on occult phenomena and so forth. I think this girl that he wrote about did have that experience, and I don't recall whether it's just a psychic experience, you know.
First is more an experience of possession. Jung's grandfather spoke through him.
That's right, yeah, or a relative.
Grandfather.
Now, to have the soul or whatever it is leave the body in such a way that somebody else can see it, I don't think he dealt with that actually, but he'd say, well, okay, so it happened. So yeah.
Did Jung do any studies on comparing drug-altered state, like hallucinations, to dream states, and the possibility of reoccurring dream in drug state?
You mean like LSD?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's kind of, I don't know how recent.
Yeah, you see, I don't know whether there were any drugs. Well, of course, Brantner was talking about some of the gases and so forth that were used. I don't think he talks about that, but of course, people have had hallucinations, but they're not drug induced. They're just neurologically induced.
There's a book called Varieties of Psychedelic Experience by Mattoon.
Oh yeah.
And there are stages in LSD experiences, and one stage he describes a lot of what Jung describes in his symbols, the symbolic stage, where people reach this stage after going through more superficial stages. And it struck me the similarities in their symbols. All these descriptions of the symbols in the Jungian, they're all the same symbol. It's almost like they, dreams or this certain drug state reach the same level.
I think that originally when LSD was first being used, that people were saying rather glibly, well, it's just the same thing as hallucinations, or it's just the same thing as dreams. And now some people at least are questioning it. They're saying we're not sure it's exactly the same. Sure, there are many similarities, and I don't think there's anything very conclusive about how closely. And how do you do it anyway? Because every dream is unique, and every hallucination is probably unique in some ways.
The thing that struck me was that certain people reached even a further stage where, okay, they could see their symbols, and all of a sudden a voice told them, or they knew what the symbols meant. It was almost beyond their dreams, because they knew exactly what the symbols meant. Did you read that part?
No, I haven't read the book. I've just read some of the reviews of it. I'll have to get to it. Well, what else? Yeah.
Is there any evidence that lower forms of life have dreams?
Yeah, the cats and other animals have rapid eye movements anyway, and some of these studies kind of hair-raising, where they stop or wake the animal or the human being, whichever it is, when the rapid eye movements begin, and human beings who are awakened consistently for 12 or 14 nights begin to hallucinate. Apparently they seem to have to catch up on their dreaming, and the cats die eventually. I mean, they don't push people to that extent, but they did push the cats, and they just died. So now, of course, there are the hard-nosed rationalists say, well, now we don't know whether it's the dreaming that's necessary or whether it's some biochemical state that goes with the dreaming that's necessary, but so far nobody's been able to separate them. If the rapid eye movements occur in human beings, the dreaming occurs, and so we infer that probably in animals it's something similar. So there is that evidence, and I think there is additional evidence, but I don't remember what it is. Yeah, back there.
If you have reoccurring dreams on the same theme, how long can you be having dreams before you think something's wrong with you? And if you keep on waking up, I don't know how many times a night. What's that?
I don't know. I wouldn't venture to say. I think it's something you should pay attention to. That's all, But I wouldn't get all on a fret that about it's being pathological. After all, this whole business is, as Brantner was saying, the difference between we have some of the same experiences that under certain conditions we call madness, and other conditions we call ecstasy or something. And the same thing is true with dreams. It's just a continuum, and sure, there are some things that are troublesome, but usually there are other signs, if you're really in big trouble, but it is something to be paid attention to.
Some people live nightmares of lives in their dreams.
Of what?
Nightmare lives every day. And,
oh, yeah. You mean like?
Is it really nowadays? Get on the couch and tell me your dreams, or is it tell me your life and tell me your dreams? How does it work?
Well, you both. I mean, I think in most analysis that you deal with both the outer situation and the dreams, and of course, if somebody's life is that bad, they usually don't get around to the dreams very soon because they have so much to deal with there. Now, the assumption in analysis, I suppose, well, yeah, you could take the outer life as symbolic. I find it important to realize that the outer and the inner are not completely separate. What happens to me in the outer world has something to do with what's in me. Now, the trouble is that as soon as you say that with some people, they get an enormous head of guilt, because that means that's my fault. And that isn't what it means at all, but it means that you're out of Tao or something, and that you have to pay attention to it, just as if it were a dream.
Is there any speculation about why the eye is associated with dreaming? Why does the eye flutter when a person dreams? Why does it associate?
That's a good question. Though they have discovered that there's sometimes a correlation, as if the eye were following some action. And there were a few dreams, very few, where the person was looking up and down, and they woke him up and found out he was watching a basketball game or something. So that there may be just kind of the obvious that you're watching something going on, and your eye would flutter in reality if you were watching something like that. Yeah.
Animals have the same thing too. That, as far as rapid eye movements, does it make any sense to talk about animals dreaming?
Well, that's what somebody else was asking. Yeah, I think so.
They not only have that, but like our cats, I mean, you can see
They
them
twitch.
dreaming that they're catching something and eating it. You know, they'll just go like that
Yeah.
in their sleep and they'll chew on something, or their whiskers will.
I'm waiting for the day when we invent something where you can get inside somebody's head and take a picture of what they're dreaming, you know. I think that would be just great. I don't know if that's going to happen or not.
Given a so-called average group of people with so-called average lives, I suppose a homogeneous group being studied, have they found a higher incidence of dreaming as a means of compensation in times of stress, or more commonly a time of hectic or high level of dreaming in times of relative, nothingness, downtime?
I don't think anybody studied that. My experience is that people tend to remember their dreams more when there isn't so much going on outside, but that doesn't mean that the actual incidence of dreaming is greater. It seems to be fairly constant, actually. So all these people they've had in the lab dream from 5 to 7 times a night or something, and the frequency is just very steady. Now, of course, most of those people probably are not in highly stressful situations, or they wouldn't be able to get them into the lab. You're very much occupied with a family problem or something. You're not going to go get wired up every night. And usually they have to have them for several nights, because the first night they don't adapt very well and things don't happen naturally. So you have to get a series of experiences. Yeah.
Is there any relation to the education level or the ethnic group between the complexity and the frequency of dreams?
I doubt if there would be on the frequency. I would think the content of the dreams might be different, but I don't think anybody studied that. It's just amazing how relatively little has been done on an actual empirical basis on this. So.
What about walking or talking in your sleep? Does that relate to problems or more intensive knowledge in a dream, like for individuals, or just more motor type person?
The walking in the sleep is not correlated with dreaming, and I think talking in the sleep is not either. Now, of course, they haven't had too many opportunities to do this, because in order to catch people doing it, you have to have them wired up or something, I suppose, because the dream state may pass before you'd be waked up naturally. But what little evidence they have is that it isn't correlated, which is amazing, because you assume when somebody's doing this that it's because they've been disturbed, and it may be at some level, but they don't have any actual images.
I was wondering, how could it come out?
Well, since we assume that everything is produced by the unconscious, it must come out of some level there, but apparently it isn't correlated with the kind of images that we usually call dreaming. Jung says there's something going on all the time, and that when you're asleep, you just are able to tune into it better. Just like the stars are there all the time, but you don't see them until the sun's down.
Can anyone go to a dream laboratory and be wired up?
I don't know. The studies they've done, I presume they even pay the subjects to do it. They usually get college students and. No, you might volunteer, and see if they'd take you.
Where's the nearest one?
Well, they have had one at the University of Chicago, and I assume it's still there. Dement, who's one, and Kleitman, I think, who are two of the main names in this field, I think are there. At least they were a few years ago.
You talked about distinguishing between conscious and unconscious in dreaming, and that dreaming seems to be safety valve or whatever you want to call it, or, you know, subconscious or unconscious. How quickly does the door go shut on that? I think we've all experienced waking up, remembering a dream in the first few moments of wakefulness, and then getting up and starting to mess around, going to work and all these other kinds of things, and forgetting the dream.
Yeah. Well, it depends on a lot of factors, and one of them is that there seems to be a kind of energy charge attached to the dream. Now, some people don't like this this notion of yes, energy and so forth, but I find it meaningful. And you know, people tell me this in therapy and so forth that the dream just, well, I know I had some dreams, but they just didn't have much energy, and so, you know, I couldn't remember them. And I'm sure there are other forces, such as if the dream is unpleasant or something, that your repressor may go to work very quickly. And other times it's just because you're more interested in something else. But I've had many experiences where I did remember a dream when I woke up, but maybe at 2 o'clock in the afternoon something happened
Suddenly,
that
yeah,
associated with it. Oh, bingo, that's right, I dreamed about such and such. Yeah, you.
So while ago you said the recurring of the nightmare that worried you. That's, I want to elaborate more on this. And another thing I'd like to know, they say that if you eat and go to sleep right after you eat, you have a dream. How much is that true? I'd like to know.
That's been kind of non-established. That they you know, people used to say it's because you ate pickles or something that you had a certain dream. But that's what's called the stomachache theory of dreams. But there's some correlation. I mean, there's some, you know, some things that occur as a result. I don't remember specifically what they are, but the physical stimuli, it's been pretty well washed out that you can explain all dreams on the basis of physical stimuli, either inside or out.
2 or 3 shots.
Yeah, do you want to tell us something? Oh.
I wanted to get into 2 questions. This, the first part of this, I wonder, dream learning, I wonder if you could, I don't know if you've gone over
Dream learning?
Yes, dream learning, if you could possibly say something on that. Also, I believe I heard someplace that people who go to sleep, where the lights are on, happen to go into the room and turn the lights off, they're more prone to contracting nightmares. Is there any...
I haven't run across anything. But what do you mean by dream learning?
See, where the people have gone to sleep and they have earphones on and pick up language.
Yeah. I don't know. Does anybody know anything about that? I think that they haven't been able to really establish that, but I'm not sure.
All I've
Do you
heard
know?
is that it doesn't
Doesn't work?
happen.
Yeah.
It's a trick.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a wishful thinking.
Yeah.
I want to answer his question from the relearning or something. From the Islamic tradition, when the Christians interpret Prophet Muhammad's vision, they say he was taught by a Christian monk. And that monk used to come when Prophet Muhammad was asleep. He used to come and read the Bible, over his head, and continuously while the Prophet is asleep. And then when the Prophet Muhammad used to wake up, he thought that this is a vision that he heard from God. I don't know whether that is true or not, but I would say there's something what he said.
I'm wondering if this goes on into brainwashing, all of the various things you've done where you're not lucid.
Well, this raises the whole question of what are these states of consciousness. And this is what some of the people who are working on hypnosis are struggling with too. Is there really such a thing as a hypnotic trance, or is it simply a a highly suggestible state, whatever that means, and it's really, is there a difference between the lowered consciousness of that they use in brainwashing, where they get people so tired and so forth that they're more susceptible, and where does that stop and sleep begin, and what is sleep, and all these things are involved in that, and this is no. No, we didn't. I guess we just sort of assumed it. But in order to give the definition of the dream, you'd have to define sleep, I suppose. And that's been, I think they're making some headway on that. But it still isn't very clear, because we all know too that we have imagery which comes up spontaneously when we are what we call awake. There's or half awake. The hypnagogic imagery, for instance, when you're on your way to going to sleep, and you have some things that come up, or when you're waking up, and other times when you're sort of dozing or something. And there must be some kind of a continuum. At one end you're awake and the other end you're asleep, but where the precise point is that you pass from one to the other, nobody knows. Who else? Anybody hasn't asked a question that wants to? Okay.
I still like to know the answer about the first question, or more elaboration on the continual reoccurring of nightmares.
Oh, yeah.
You said that worries you.
We didn't get back to that. No, I just said that when you have a recurring dream or a recurring theme, that it means to me you should pay attention to it. I don't mean it's something to worry about, but it may be something tremendous. It may be opening up a whole new avenue of life to you. Who knows? But the fact that it recurs means that it's important. I was trying to say something to you.
How do you upgrade a dream? Like in my dreams,
How do you what?
Upgrade your dreams. Like in my dreams, I try to cut out something I didn't want to dream because I read it in a book that it could be done. Well, it didn't actually work. But I mean, Einstein is getting things, and I'm getting car accidents and pilots, and this is ridiculous. I mean, I have other dreams too, and visions and things, but I really like to do a little better.
I don't know, except just to keep working on them and try to work on whatever problems that are involved. And as you develop psychically, your dreams may get more interesting or more acceptable to you. I don't know. I never thought of it that way, to tell you the truth. Yeah.
Do you have a book that you would recommend that would extend further what we've been talking about for the very much layman?
Just about dreams and their...
And this altered state of consciousness, or different levels of consciousness?
The different levels of consciousness, I don't know a specific place, but I think that just for an explanation of dreams, or at least of Jung's theory of dreams, this article in the book called Man and His Symbols is the most readily available. That's and it's quite a good summary. He wrote that very near the time he died, and he really pulled together a lot of the stuff that he'd been saying over many years. So that's a good place. Now, does anybody have any suggestions about the altered state of consciousness? That book called The Altered States of Consciousness, I think, suggests a lot of things, and including some of the dream material. So that might be helpful if you. No, it's edited by Charles Tart. Came out within the last year, I think. Oh, let's see. Which of you has asked more questions?
I think I
no, let's let him.
I'd like to ask one thing about the altered state of consciousness that we keep throwing around.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't get I'm never under the impression that my consciousness is altered in any way. I mean, I have the feeling that it's going different places. But I don't ever feel that there's any kind of qualitative change.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe right now my consciousness is centered around this room and what's going on, what's being said, and maybe an hour later it'll be centered on something in my brain, or I'll be sleeping or something like this. But I never get the feeling that it's heightened or depressed or